Well, there you have it. Kristopher Love found guilty in connection with the murder of Miss Hatcher, Kendra Hatcher. And now, today, begins the sentencing phase, the penalty phase. Will he be sentenced to death? That becomes the main question. But before we get there, let's talk about the verdict. And joining me right now on this Monday morning, my special Monday guest, Law and Crime trial analyst, Jonna Spilbor.
It must be Monday. Hi, Jesse.
It must be Monday. Okay. So he was found guilty. Where do you think the defense went wrong here? Or where do you think the prosecution, their strongest argument was?
Well, you know, there was a whole lot of evidence in support of the verdict that the jury came to. What I really think is going to be very telling in this next phase is the speed with which the jury came back with their verdict. Jesse, this is a capital case. Juries took basically 2 hours to come back with a guilty verdict on behalf of him. So that begs the question then, what kind of mitigating evidence is this defense team going to be able to present to this jury to get them off executing this defendant?
Yeah, and the prosecution put on a really strong case. Let's show some of that right now with the prosecution's closing argument where they sum it up really nicely. Take a look. Well, look, we can't talk about the guilty verdict here without talking about the testimony of Crystal Cortez. And Jonna, this woman who apparently took a plea deal for 35 years in connection with being part of this murder-for-hire plot.
Yeah.
The question was, can we believe her or not?
Right.
The prosecution says, you may not like her, but you have to believe her, and the evidence backs up her statement. The defense is saying, well, wait a second. She had every reason to lie.
Right.
She lied in the past. What makes anyone believe that she wasn't the person that pulled that trigger? What did you think of that argument?
You know, that argument was the crux of the defense case because the defense didn't put on a case, right? So what their strategy was to poke holes in the prosecution, a quintessential, you know, lack of a reasonable doubt kind of case. And it's common when you have co-defendants. Now, these co-defendants weren't tried together, obviously, but it's common when you have a co-defendant situation for each co-defendant to be doing this. It wasn't me, it was him. No, it wasn't me, it was her. And that's exactly what they tried to do here, but they didn't back it up with, let's say, the testimony of the defendant himself because he didn't take the stand and testify.
Was there something else, a different strategy that they need to go with, or was their best argument, hey, saying, like, look, we can't show that he wasn't involved. We can't show that he wasn't having these communications. Everything's backing it up, but maybe we can say he wasn't the trigger person.
That really was the only plausible avenue for this defense team because the evidence was, you know, plentiful. We know that he was there. We know that he participated. The only issue, the defense was trying to get the jury to exacto knife this case and say, wait a minute, he was only involved this much, so for the rest of it, you have to find reasonable doubt.
You think that video that you're seeing right there, his police interrogation tape, did him in?
I'm sure that that helped. And again, there was no evidence that the defense could present. Their whole case was based on cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses.
Well, as we've talked about, a lot of the time, Crystal Cortez, her testimony was backed up by evidence that was shown in the courtroom. It wasn't like the jury just settled on her testimony. And one of the things that the jury saw was the testimony of Hashem Saad, who's provided a 911 phone call because he was right there in the parking garage, right in the area when the shooting took place. Let's play that 911 phone call for you right now. Wow. So this is a witness who really didn't see what was happening, but really about what he heard. And Jonna, that's impactful for a jury. You have to imagine that was something that they considered in their deliberations.
Yeah, and we call these witnesses, instead of eyewitnesses, we call them ear witnesses, which is helpful. But it would have been even more helpful if he were able to see who was the trigger person, because the whole defense was it wasn't Mr. Love, it was his cohort.
You know, the jury deliberated for about 2 hours before they handed down the guilty verdict, and they asked to listen to the jailhouse call between the defendant and his girlfriend, where he says he should have gotten rid of the gun. About 5 minutes later, they had their verdict. What do you think they were looking for? Why do you think they wanted to hear that call before they rendered their decision?
You know, I don't think it was a situation where there was one holdout and that was it for this one person. I think everybody was probably in agreement from the get-go, and that was just to confirm what they had already planned to do. Just because when you have an important case, a big, impactful case like this, and it only takes you 2 hours to come to a verdict, that means that they were probably all on the same page the moment they walked into the deliberation room and took their first vote.
And I wonder if that was just like, let's listen to it one more time before we give our decision.
Yes.
We know we have a man's life at stake, and now it's going to be a capital murder decision. It's going to be in the sense of the death penalty. There's a lot at stake for this guy.
Oh my God, there's an incredible amount at stake. And if you're just reading the tea leaves, the fact that it only took 2 hours to come to the guilty verdict does not bode well for Mr. Love.
I can guarantee you that. We're going to talk more about this. I'm really curious on how this whole death penalty phase is going to work, because there's a lot to talk about here. We keep forgetting, and it's not so easy for a jury to sit back and say, hey, we're gonna find him, recommend the death penalty here. I mean, that's not an easy thing to do. So, Jonna, stand by. We're going to talk more about this. We're going to go to a quick break, and when we come back, a lot more to discuss. Stay tuned. Wow. Jonna, one of the things that we can't help think about is the stalking nature of this, right? They tracked her for weeks.
Right.
Is that what makes this such an aggravated shooting, such a way where you look at it and you say, you can't get more premeditated than this?
I was going to say, that's the epitome of premeditation, and probably the main reason why this case was charged the way it is. It also begs the question for me, Jesse, like, this is what I've had a hard time wrapping my head around for this whole trial. The defense theory of the case was basically, this was a robbery gone bad, that if you're standing in the defense attorney's shoes, my client never intended to kill this victim. He only wanted to rob this victim. And doesn't it make sense to only want to rob somebody in this love triangle situation? The answer to that is no. It doesn't make any sense. I don't think the jury bought that for a second. But even if they did, I don't think it would have changed the game any. I mean, this is a killing in connection with a felony. We have the felony murder rule. I don't know how they thought that was going to do any good, except maybe keep the death penalty off the table. Were
you ever concerned that the prosecution was getting too much in the mud here about the idea of, hey, we're talking so much about Brenda Delgado. This is about Kristopher Love. We have to remember why he's on trial. Did you ever think that was a concern for the prosecution, that they were focusing too much on her and not enough on him?
I don't think the focus was the concern for the prosecution as much as having to explain the fact that they gave Delgado is escaping the death penalty because of the deal they negotiated with Mexico to get her here. The other co-defendant, Ms. Cortez, escaping the death penalty because she struck a deal to testify against this defendant. Those are the two things that I think hurt the prosecution the most in terms of the ultimate punishment.
Do you think that's fair? That the woman who planned all this and set this in motion, she will not be up for the death penalty. Kristopher Cortez, the getaway driver, someone who was intimately involved with this, not going to be up for the death penalty, gets 35 years, and he is the only one who could face the death penalty? I'm
glad you asked that question, because I predict if Kristopher Love escapes the death penalty, that's going to be the reason. The reason's going to be the person who masterminded it not getting it, the person who was the, quote, getaway driver not getting it. Why then are we going to sentence this defendant to death?
The answer to that could be because he shot her.
Because he shot her.
Because he shot her.
I know.
He's the one who caused it, right?
That's all the defense can hang their hat on to try to mitigate this case.
And that may be what they have, because that's what we're going to be covering today. We're going to be covering the sentencing phase. You do not want to miss it. This is, I believe, the first death penalty eligible case that we've had in Texas since 2013. But before we get there, let's play the body cam footage of Sergeant Michael Welsh. This is really illustrative of what was going on, and I believe you will see a blurred out image of the victim. Obviously, we're not going to show that to you, but you will see the blurred out image, and you can get a better understanding of what the crime scene looked like. Take a look. Okay, so one of the things to note there is that the idea that this was a close-range shooting, I think they found a shell casing in her car. Jonna, when the jury was thinking about that, how did that affect their decision, you think?
Well, I think it left little question in their mind that this was an intentional killing. I mean, it's not, you can't float the theory that it's a robbery gone wrong and then have a point-blank execution to the head of this young dentist.
Right, and that's what the defense was trying to go with.
Yeah.
That this all he was guilty of was a robbery and he didn't do anything.
Which also makes no sense, Jesse. Why robbery?
That's what they said. They said, what makes sense in this case? And clearly they didn't think it made sense. But honestly, this whole case doesn't quite make sense, but we are going to talk more about it right after this. Okay, so as we talk about the sentencing phase, I'm back here with Law&Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. Do you imagine that her mother will also provide that same kind of statement as a victim impact statement in the sentencing phase. So the jury gets a better understanding of what everyone's life is like without Kendra Hatcher.
Yeah, yes. I almost think, I mean, this is just heartbreaking and heart-wrenching testimony, almost more important for the penalty phase of this than it was in the guilt phase. I mean, we really didn't, you know, this heart-wrenching testimony wasn't necessary to prove who the trigger person was. This was just to prove that, oh my God, here's a mother's pain when she finds out that her beautiful daughter has been gunned down in cold blood.
And haven't we seen a little bit of the sentencing already, in the sense that
yes.
You see the photo of Kendra Hatcher in the background constantly while each witness was testifying? Isn't the trial almost like a sentencing in and of itself?
Yeah, I mean, even though they are actually technically separate, of course there's going to be some crossover in there. And the sentencing phase is probably going to be more important for the defendant in this case because he's got a tougher row to hoe, Jesse. I mean, you know how these sentencing phases work. It's almost, there's this inherent contradiction where somebody maintains their innocence during the guilt phase, then comes the penalty phase, and all of a sudden it's, you know, please forgive me, and here's why I did it, and I'm so sorry, and spare my life.
Yeah, and talking about some really impactful statements, let's play the testimony of Ricardo. So this was the ex-boyfriend of Brenda Delgado, the person who's alleged to have started this whole murder for hire plot. He was dating the victim, Kendra Hatcher, and he explained his version of events, what happened. Take a look. Can you imagine what it's like being him? The fact that he was the centerpiece for this whole murder for hire plot? What do you think is going on in his mind?
There could be a little level of inner guilt, even though this is entirely not his fault, right? He didn't have anything to do with it. Although I do, you know, I don't know if we got to hear much of why Brenda Delgado was so obsessed. And what, you know, normally what happens, Jesse, is when people are obsessed like this, they send horrible text messages to the new girlfriend. They stalk their Facebook page. They don't take that extra leap and have that person brutally murdered. So obviously, Brenda Delgado wasn't wrapped too tight, you know, to say the least.
Right. And it's a senseless murder. It's a senseless act. Why was this young pediatric dentist taken away at such a young age? It makes no sense. But we should understand how she died. So I want to play the testimony of the medical examiner, in case you missed it, who will go into the details about the actual gunshot wounds. And it was important for the jury to hear this. Take a look. Back to front. Jonna, what does that tell you?
That tells you this was an execution, Jesse. Right to the back of the head, out the front of her face. That's horrible. And it also does not help the defense one iota that that's how this woman was shot and killed.
We talked about what makes sense.
Right.
So the defense kept saying this was a robbery. This doesn't happen in a robbery like this usually.
No, exactly. And let's be clear, because you said it earlier, none of this makes sense. But in terms of trying to decide whether this defendant is guilty or not, to say that it was done in the course and scope of a robbery and to have this basically point blank to the back of the head shooting does not jive with the defense theory of the case.
Yeah, and I want to talk more when we get back from our break about what could actually happen in the penalty phase here. But one quick question, if I have time, I want to ask you just about the medical examiner. In general, how much does the jury think about the medical examiner testimony when they're ultimately coming to the deliberations?
So it's really hard in a case like this where the jury has to look at some of the same evidence that the medical examiner looked at. That is so hard for a layperson, Jesse. Like, when you look at autopsy photos and you look at horrific scenes like that, that leaves such an impact on you that you never forget it. And I think the jury, obviously, when you're not used to seeing those images, it can stay with you for the rest of your life, and that's really, really hard.
Yeah, I can imagine also seeing the photos of the victim right there constantly. You know that's in the jury's mind. Right. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, a lot more to discuss, and we will be live in this case today. Okay, so we're learning a little bit more about the obsession that apparently Brenda Delgado allegedly had for Ricardo. Now, Jonna, I'm going to ask you straight up, why do so many of the cases we cover involve this kind of obsession in a love triangle, or that someone becomes obsessed with another individual and then leads to violence. Can you explain that?
Yes. Hell hath no fury as a person scorned, not just a woman, people, as a person. And this it epitomizes that, right? Obviously, and this witness was key because she establishes the motive of Ms. Delgado being so obsessed with her now ex-boyfriend that she was going to interfere with his happiness by getting rid of the one person that was making him happy, and she didn't care how she did it. Maybe she wasn't going to get her own hands dirty, but she paid somebody else to do it, and that's an important part of this puzzle.
Well, you know, Jennifer Escobar is not the only person that testified about Brenda Delgado. We also saw Milton Martinez. Let's see that. So, Jonna, what it sounds like to me is when this occurred, the shooting happened, and Brenda Delgado became implicated and arrested, people weren't that surprised that she did this or that was, you know, planned this whole thing.
Well, the people in her circle apparently, I don't want to say they saw it coming, but they knew that she was obsessed with her ex-boyfriend and that this was causing her a bit of consternation, to put it mildly. What kind of confuses me is that when you have somebody that's that obsessed, and I've seen this movie before, typically the other people, like the persons who had her ire, the ex-boyfriend and the new girlfriend, are privy to it. In other words, she wouldn't have been silent. She would have been calling and texting and sending posting terrible comments and things like that. And it doesn't seem like there was any intervention between those moments, if they occurred, and then what happened here. There was no roadblock, in other words, is what I'm trying to say. She just was able to steamroll and get the job done.
And there was no way to prevent this, you know? People that knew her, they had the idea that she'd be capable of this.
You know, and probably her friends thought that she was upset over the loss of this relationship, but that it wasn't going to go as far as it did. I hope that's what they thought.
What do you think her trial is going to be like?
Well, death penalty is not on the table for her. She's going to skate. Even if she spends the rest of her life in jail, she masterminded this. She is as guilty as the trigger person. So, you know, what's to try? Honestly, what's to try? I think she's pretty much defenseless here and can look forward to spending as much time behind bars as Miss Cortez is going to be spending behind bars.
Well, we got to understand more about the relationship in this love triangle. So when Ricardo took the stand, he talked a little bit about if Brenda knew about Kendra. Let's see. Okay, so Jonna, Kendra didn't even know Brenda. She was planning on getting married to Ricardo. She was living her life. She was working as a dentist, and she gets killed. I mean, literally, this is such a disturbing case on so many levels. But the idea that she was just living her life and she's gunned down, that's the really aggravating nature of it, I think.
Well, to me, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because, of course, if you're going to marry somebody, you know a little bit about their history, including their past loves. And nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm just going to kill my ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend. There had to be some sort of clue along the way. Somebody had to have known something. So to me, it's striking that the victim here had no idea who Miss Delgado was.
And the idea of when we're moving into the penalty phase here, what can we expect from today?
So I think what we can expect is not knowing whether or not this defendant is going to try to save his own life by taking the stand and addressing this jury. Because as I mentioned before, all death penalty cases have this inherent contradiction where you maintain your innocence and then all of a sudden you're begging for the jury to spare your life. And that's hard to do if you're going to continue to say, I didn't do this, I'm innocent.
We've seen defendants stand up, provide a statement, say they're sorry, maybe not say they're sorry, say they're a product of their environment. Does that affect a jury in any which way?
You know, it can. If we get information that he had this terrible childhood and that's what compelled him to take money to kill somebody execution style, we'll see what the jury does with that.
Yeah, this is going to be one you want to watch. As soon as we have the live feed in that Texas courtroom, we're going to make sure to go there. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk more love and we'll talk about our new trial. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. Let's talk about our live trials of the day and what we are going to be covering. First up, we're going to be live in a brand new case. This one is out of Iowa, and it concerns a man who is on trial. His name is Zachary Paul Cohen. He's 28 years old, and he faces first-degree murder and child endangerment charges in connection with the death of his 4-month-old son, Sterling Daniel Cohen. And this is a really horrific case where this young boy was found dead in a truly horrible set of circumstances. You'll read more about it. We'll talk more about it. His wife, Cheyenne Harris, 20 years old, she's also been charged. She is going to be tried in a separate trial. Today, we believe the jury will be seated. That's what the judge hopes for, and maybe opening statements later in the afternoon. We'll talk more about that case out of Iowa in a little bit, but I do want to preview it for you right now. We are also going to be live today, and we're waiting for the live feed. In the Kristopher Love case, the man who was found guilty of killing Kendra Hatcher, a pediatric dentist, he was found guilty of killing her as part of a murder for hire plot. This is a live feed into the courtroom, by the way, as part of a murder for hire plot where he was hired by a woman named Brenda Delgado to kill her because Brenda became enraged by the fact that Kendra was dating her ex-boyfriend. We've been talking about this case this morning. We'll talk about it a little bit more because today begins the sentencing phase, and this man, after being found guilty of capital murder, could face the death penalty. But right now, we have an update for you in the synagogue shooting. And I know everybody has been following this really, really horrific case that happened at a Pittsburgh synagogue over the weekend. And the person who's been arrested, Robert Bowers, he faces multiple murder charges and hate crimes. And now it is potentially possible that he may face the death penalty. In fact, today, we believe that there is going to be a hearing where prosecutors press for the death penalty in connection with this case. It should be noted that Scott Brady, who's the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania, said he began the process of getting the approval for the death penalty and trying to get Attorney Jeff Sessions to approve that. And you will need that. It's a requirement to get the Attorney General's approval in these federal cases. So I'm back here with Jonna Spilbor. The likelihood that they can get that approval in this case, what do you think?
Clearly, it's a hate crime. So I don't think it's going to be a problem at all. It's interesting to me that the feds are sort of taking over the prosecution of this case as opposed to the state, which begs the question, and I don't know this off the top of my head. Does Pennsylvania not have the death penalty? That's what I'd like to know, because if not, then it makes perfect sense for the feds to take over, get the death penalty vis-a-vis the hate crime aspect of these charges, and clearly this was a hate crime.
How does his attorneys even try to say that this is not a death penalty eligible case?
Just, I mean, at this early stage, the only defense I think that is mountable is obviously there's a mental health issue here. And that's going to have to be further explored.
Is there really, though? Because what we're seeing, if he deliberately took an attack against the Jewish community, and there's been evidence put forward that he has hated on this community for quite some time, and he took these deliberate steps to gun down 11 people, allegedly, and he faces now 29 criminal counts. It's going to be hard to mount a defense that he is not all psychologically there and didn't know what he was doing.
Jesse, I think I would take the exact opposite approach. How can you be filled with such hate and take a look at Sandy Hook, for example, and the Las Vegas shooting? How can you be filled with that much hate and kill people based on that hate if you are perfectly healthy mentally? You cannot. It just defies logic to me. I feel sorry for whoever is going to have to defend him, but they're going to have to explore that aspect of his personality.
The Anti-Defamation League has called this attack the deadliest against the Jewish community in U.S. history. Does this scare you moving forward? I mean, we see these kinds of mass shootings. This one was targeted against a specific group. Are you concerned moving forward where we're headed?
I hope this is not. No, I don't think this is a sign of something bigger to come. I want to believe that this is an isolated incident involving an individual who clearly has, for lack of a better word, something really wrong with him. Where I do think we're going to see some future changes is, you know, he lawfully owned these guns, which is interesting because if you have a mental health issue, technically your guns can be taken away from you. So what happened if he's been hate-filled all this time? Who missed the mark here? Who failed to see that? Who allowed him to keep his permission to carry firearms? That's something that I think we're going to explore in the future.
Well, it's horrible. It's a horrific crime, and we are going to update you more when we have more information about what's happening in that hearing with Mr. Bowers. But we're going to switch gears right now. Let's focus back on Love, the Kristopher Love case, which we are hoping to be live in any moment. We can't talk about this case without talking about the testimony of Crystal Cortez, the getaway driver, the person who took a plea deal for 35 years in exchange for testifying against Mr. Love, and we believe she's going to testify against Ms. Delgado as well. Let's play some of her testimony in case you missed it. And we did this, and we did this, and we did this. Jonna, this witness is testifying to details that we can't necessarily back up. The idea that he was cleaning the bullets, Kristopher Love. So why should we believe her? She took a plea deal, 35 years. The jury obviously believed her, but why should we believe her?
Well, and that was precisely what the defense's biggest point was. I remember during their closing argument, why should we believe her? The only reason, their argument is, the only reason she's testifying in this case the way she did is because she got a sweetheart deal, although, 35 years isn't anything to sneeze at, from the prosecution. And part of the deal in any prosecution decision to give a break to somebody in exchange for their testimony is you have to be truthful, and hopefully it leads to a conviction. And I'm sure she sat down with prosecutors and was well coached before she took the stand in this case.
One thing to note, the feed that we're showing you, that is a live feed into the Kristopher Love courtroom. We expect the penalty phase to begin any moment. I just want to let our viewers know that we are monitoring it, so as soon as it starts up, we'll go there. But, John, I got to ask you, without Crystal Cortez's testimony, would they have secured a guilty verdict?
I think the jury could have come back with the same verdict, even without her testimony, simply based on the other evidence. And again, look, it's fairly infrequent that cases are open and shut. This was not open and shut, but there was plenty of evidence to connect the dots here, and the jury probably could have come back.
Strong witness for them. Strong witness for them. But let's play some other testimony that, in case you missed, you got to hear, because if you haven't heard the testimony of Jose Ortiz, who was a friend of Brenda Delgado, you really should. This is a man whose truck was used, unknowingly to him, in connection with this crime. And one other weird aspect, he actually had a little bit of a thing for Crystal Cortez. Let's play his testimony right now. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. We are live right now in the Kristopher Love case. And what was just read for the record was the criminal record of Kristopher Love. He's been convicted of aggravated assault, aggravated robbery, and burglary of a building. Records, if you want to do some investigation into him, that he has fled police in the past, failed to appear in court, stolen vehicles, and possessed a weapon despite being a convicted felon. In the months before he was arrested in connection with Hatcher's death, he was allegedly using drugs, engaged in prostitution, and distributed illegal substances. So you can see quite the record he has. That is being the first part of the penalty phase, which is occurring right now. James Grisby, who's the head of security at the XPO Logistics, he's an ex-Memphis Police Department officer. Let's go live and we can learn a little bit more about how his testimony will come into play in the penalty phase.
What your role was and how your team kind of worked there.
So robbery in the 90s and early 2000s, we were designed as a tracking unit. We were designed to track multiple robberies, businesses, and individuals as well.
Okay, so let's just jump in for one quick second. Jonna, we heard that record being read into evidence. The jury heard that.
Yeah.
Aggravating factor?
Yeah, it certainly does not evoke any sort of sympathy on behalf of this defendant. Now, I was thinking as he's saying this that, he doesn't sound like a very nice person, this defendant, obviously.
He sounds like he'd be great with kids.
But, yes, we can't joke. But could this be turned around and used to help him? In other words, did this defendant Kristopher Love embark on this life of crime, this escalating life of crime, because he had such a terrible, horrible childhood that this was the path and nobody intervened. And that's why we should feel sorry for him, ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
You know, John, I'm so happy you brought that up. We have seen that constantly being used. Does it ever work? Because isn't the argument to say, hey, a lot of people had tough upbringings and they didn't grow up to be criminals. So how does a defense successfully articulate that argument?
It's going to be difficult. This is such a brutal crime, Jesse, really. And it's hard to feel sorry for a person like Kristopher Love after he point blank executes somebody, an innocent person, in the back of the head. But you have to remember, from a defense standpoint, they got to use what they got. And if that's what they have, then they have to go ahead and present that and see what the jury will do.
And what does the defense do in this case? What kind of witnesses? Do they bring people out that knew Kristopher Love when he was young and try to explain his history and what he suffered and all that?
Yeah, I am so glad you brought that up, because what they cannot do, they're not going to be able to bring people on the stand to say, Kristopher Love was just a little misunderstood. What a great guy. When he wasn't robbing banks and killing people, he was going to church regularly. Like, that's not going to happen.
Right.
So they're not going to be able to redeem him that way. They have to hit on the one or two things that's going to resonate with this jury to allow them to keep this man alive and in prison for the rest of his life, as opposed to a lethal injection.
Now, one of the things you just saw in the courtroom is that the jury is leaving. They are going to work on some matters outside of the jury's presence. Let's jump back live into the courtroom. We can learn a little more. Okay, so we're trying to make sense about what's happening right now. I think the defense had objected and said that the officer's testimony who's currently on the stand will include people involved in multiple robberies. This prevents the jury from making a proper conclusion. Jonna, what do you think about that argument?
And again, the defense is really rather hamstrung here because they don't have a lot to work with. So they're going to do whatever they have to do. Jury is not going to hang their hats on his criminal history in terms of making their final decision on the penalty phase. It's one component of it. So we'll see what the judge does with this. I don't think it's not monumental.
Their whole job, though, is to, would they say if his team says, hey, we had a successful day in court because we got him off the death penalty. We got him off death row.
Right.
That would be a win for them.
Oh, my goodness. Yes, that would be a huge win for them at this point. And again, I keep hearkening back to the fact that this jury took 2 hours to come to their guilty verdict. There's not a lot of sympathy here. They're very convinced of his guilt. So it's going to be an uphill battle for this defense team to keep him from getting executed, or to keep the death penalty from being imposed. So we'll see, Jesse.
We will see. So there's a sidebar going on right now. We're going to take a quick break on our end, and when we come back, a lot more to talk about in Love. Welcome back, everybody. We are providing a live feed right now into the Kristopher Love penalty phase. Remember, he was already found guilty of killing Kendra Hatcher, and now becomes the question, will he be sentenced to death? Because that's on the table here. Now, at the beginning part of the day, his criminal record was being read into evidence, and it's pretty extensive. On the stand is a man named James Grigsby. He was an ex-Memphis officer from the Memphis Police Department, and he was talking about one of the crimes that Mr. Love was apparently convicted of, and that was a robbery. Now, there was an objection. The jury was moved out of the room. The objection right now is that they said that the officer's testimony will include people involved in multiple robberies. And the argument that the defense said is this will prevent the jury from making a proper conclusion. So while they work that out, we're waiting for the jury to come back in. I'm talking with Jonna Spilbor about what we can expect here in the penalty phase. And I don't remember if it was you and I who talked about it, but the idea that even if you're sitting in the jury and you were selected for jury duty and you said, I could make an informed decision, a reasonable decision, an impartial decision about the death penalty,
right.
At the end of the day, when you are sitting there and you see Kristopher Love day in and day out, it might be difficult for a person to vote in favor of the death penalty.
I respectfully disagree with that.
Then I wasn't talking to you. I don't remember who it was.
Couldn't have been me. Because this is a death-qualified jury. So they are tasked with and have said that they are okay with sentencing a person to death if the evidence and the situation warrants. So far, we have not heard one redeeming thing about this defendant. And what the jury is left with is that 3 days ago, they found him guilty of being the trigger person and putting a bullet in an innocent dentist's head.
But finding someone guilty and finding them in favor and recommending the death penalty may be two separate things, and we'll talk more about it in a minute, but we're going to go live back into that courtroom right now. What's going on right now in court is they are literally going through the details of Mr. Love's prior criminal record, and this is the time he was arrested and convicted for aggravated robbery back in September 2005. Jonna, what is the jury going to be making of this as we listen to the details of these other crimes?
So think about what their job is in this phase. In the penalty phase, their job is to determine whether there is sufficient mitigation to spare his life, or whether there's sufficient aggravation to do what the prosecution wants them to do and sentence this man to death. So this is part of the prosecution's case in the penalty phase, and they're plodding along to try to help the jury decide that there's plenty of aggravating circumstances here, beginning with the criminal history of Kristopher Love.
Yeah, and it seems pretty extensive. We'll talk more about it after this break, so stay tuned here on Law and Crime. We'll be right back. Okay, so no shocker here. Kristopher Love has quite the criminal record of aggravated assault, aggravated robbery, burglary of a building. And in fact, we're learning that, basically in the months leading up to his arrest for the Hatcher killing, he was using drugs, selling substances, engaged in prostitution. Jonna, makes you think this is maybe one of the reasons why Brenda Delgado tried to enlist his help, that she felt he was a skilled criminal. Or experienced criminal.
Oh, well, good point. Because she's not going to, bless you,
Sorry.
she's not going to be able to get you or me to, no matter what she paid us to do a heinous crime like this. So she had to go to the dregs to find somebody who was willing to take a buck to execute somebody. And it's very sad. And the more I'm listening to this, Jesse, I'll put $5 on the fact that I think he is going to take the stand in the penalty phase here.
All right, I might hold you to that.
$5.
Okay,
right.
Let's see. We'll wait and see. Jonna, thank you so much for coming
Always
on.
a pleasure.
Great having you.
Thanks.
Take a quick break. We'll be right back, and we'll be live in Love.